Daniel Bessner, are you there?
Yes, sir.
Okay, Daniel Bessner is joining us.
Bessner.
We're framing this content. It was either going to be like a book reading with Bessner. Matt has coined bullshitting with Bessner, which is
I like BSing with Bessner.
BSing with Bessner. Yeah, BSing with Bessner. Bessner and I and Bessner of us have had some great BS sessions. So Daniel, this is going to be it's sort of like, informal history, BSing with Bessner. We're going to talk about a little bit of a lesson of the relationship between Hollywood, the Pentagon, and the militarization of policing. And I actually really want to start by playing this clip. I really strongly recommend everybody watch the full segment that Anna Kasparian did. It's just excellent on our Jacobin show, Weekends with Anna and Michael, which of course everybody should subscribe to and watch in general. But this commentary she did this last week on militarism and policing was just brilliant. And she also dug up this ad that as soon as I saw, I knew I had to play for Bessner. I mean, even regardless of whether we were doing a segment or not, this is just manna of content here for Bessner. And the relationship, I mean, in this video game ad between, police militarization, racism, valorizing the police, and just sort of general American violence. So let's play this clip, and then we'll get to the bigger history to lesson here.
It was glorified, really, in all sorts of propaganda, including in video games. So there's one video game known as Police Quest, and I just want to show you what the commercials look like.
Meet the men and women who risk their lives daily in the most violent city in the nation, LA's SWAT specialists.
We are a life-saving organization, and that's what we do most of the time. We use all of our tactics and all of our training to resolve a situation without hurting anyone. But sometimes there's no way around that, and when that happens, it's a suspect that he decides the way it's going to end.
Learn their tactical maneuvers. Witness their instinct for sensing danger. Follow their daring adventures in Police Quest 5, LAPD SWAT.
And by the way, Jacobin, so many important talks.
So at any rate, yes. And again, I'll just encourage again, I mean, that's just a fantastic commentary that Anna did there. And, she fit that in well as some very great and revealing footage of Daryl Gates, who was involved in the creation of SWAT as the head of LAPD. But Bessner, reaction to that, and then just take us out here, because the relationship between the video game industry, the movie industry, television, and I mean, we know very specifically with regards to the Pentagon, the intelligence agencies, there's literally liaison offices, like that's very strongly established, even bragged about in some respects. But we include also, policing as well. We could really, I think in a kind of loose way, say the entire entertainment and the American national security state apparatus, foreign and domestic.
Yeah, so I think this is something that's been going on for a long time, of course. Very famously, there have been cop radio programs in the 20s and 30s, the cop shows in the 40s and the 50s and everything like that. So this is not a new relationship between the domestic apparatus of violence and pop culture. But I do think that in the last 20 or 30 years, it's become pretty clear that in a world of different genre forms of television, that the police procedural and the police show has clearly taken off. And it's funny that Anna showed that old ad that must have been from the late 90s of Police Quest.
The late 80s, actually.
Oh, are you sure? Because I'm pretty sure Police Quest 4 was like 93.
Okay, no, 93 sounds about right.
Yeah.
Right.
So I remember because one of the first games I played was Police Quest 4, and it was called Daryl F. Gates Presents Police Quest 4, which is actually in the wake of the LA riots, I believe, which Gates was forced to resign soon thereafter, I believe relatively soon. And so he had a real big influence on sort of how people understood policing in the United States because of his influence on pop culture. And so what does this mean? So of course, as everyone knows, listening to this, after the end of the Cold War, the United States emerged as this great superpower, and it is searching for logic, right? And one of the logics for world governance that it needs to affirm is that it's not a broken society, right? And so there's this enormous tough on crime rhetoric that emerges in the late 1980s and early 1990s with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the rise of the Cold War. And I think, have you seen that documentary, LA 92? It's a National Geographic documentary.
Yeah.
So it starts with George W. Bush's invasion of Kuwait. Using the Gulf War I to repel Saddam Hussein's invasion from Kuwait, and then it juxtaposes that with the Rodney King beating, right? So there's this important moment in American history where decision makers are re-articulating what they want their citizens' relationship to violence to be in the project of this larger global program to persuade people that the United States is a just society, particularly to people of color, which is why, for example, and then I'll stop talking, what are two of the biggest exports of the 1990s in terms of American pop culture? Michael Jordan and Michael Jackson, right? So there's this turn to American multiculturalism that is this post-Cold War project related to the increasing militarization of American police and the subjugation of domestic dissent. So it's all interrelated.
No, and how does this relate then to, like, it's just like basically, even I think actually Thaddeus Russell made this point to me, that he was saying, like, even relative to the 80s, which we think of as like this incredibly revanchist reactionary time, and it was. I mean, Ronald Reagan literally announces his candidacy talking about states' rights in Philadelphia, Mississippi, as Noam Chomsky pointed out, where the only national profile it had was literally because that's where Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman were murdered going and doing civil rights work. But even then, and you can check this out, just going through kind of, basic pop culture rabbit hole, like, yeah, it wasn't like there was a lot of pop products where, like the whole police department was rotten, or the entire Pentagon was bad. But even then, as Thad pointed out, there was a lot more willingness, it seemed like, for like, okay, yes, but there is like this group of generals that's really evil, or even just in the 70s. I mean, this is actually one of the great movies ever made. I mean, Serpico was made into a movie, and that is true, that like his whistleblowing revealed something. I think literally half of the NYPD, if not more, being involved in everything from violence, brutality, to like systemic corruption. We don't really see that at all. I mean, I'm thinking even like in 2007, Iron Man sort of critiques private military contractors while disaggregating that from the Pentagon entirely, as if like the Pentagon is just this noble, I mean, maybe not that observant thing, because these evil arms contractors are hustling it, but still, that's completely out of the equation in terms of the systemic police or Pentagon critique. Last thing I'll say real quick, I was watching the other day, I watched a little bit of 21 Jump Street remake with God, I'm completely spacing their names.
Jonah Hill and Channing Tatum.
Exactly. And I mean, there's stuff in the first 20 minutes of like, they're at a park and they're bored with their profile. So they're like, they're like threatening to kill people. They're, the fact that they don't read someone's Miranda rights, like, it's actually ruins their case, but it's just played as a joke. This is also like when he's, anyways, you're watching this and you're actually like, if you've, particularly in this moment, but really at any moment, you're aware of like the murders, obviously, that we're talking about. This, petrifying that is just sort of played for a laugh. I mean, it's not satire. It's not like, poking fun at the institution. It's just like, yeah, it's funny.
Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting point, and in some sense, the American ideological tapestry is incredibly complex, right? So this country has traditions of both anti-state force, anti-state authority, and pro-state force and pro-state authority. And you could point to, radical traditions going back to Thomas Paine, to Hamilton, and different approaches to the issue of essentially organized state violence in relation to its citizenry. So these ebb and flow over time. And of course, as I'm sure many people already listening know, in material on the ground, basically modern police forces are relics of the post-Civil War era. In the South, to police the freedmen, and in the North, to police essentially labor militancy. So that sort of material reality interacts at various moments with the ideological strands that I'm talking about. So then the real question that I think we need to ask ourselves is what changed in the 90s, in the 2000s, in the 2010s that got rid of that implicit critique. In Serpico, that's the one that I was thinking of, but I think in a lot of movies, like take, for example, The Godfather, one of the bad guys is McCluskey, right? The Irish cop. And so there's a recognition that state authority can be corrupt that is not as relevant today. So I think
it's so funny in the book, in the Godfather book, the cop that defends Michael Corleone from McCluskey, when McCluskey's just being an absolute, just out of control asshole at the hospital when he's trying to pull security off of the Don. In the book, McCluskey's like second in command is defending Michael Corleone, and what's great is that it's not because like he's a good cop, it's because he's like a Corleone cop. So it's just like competing payrolls. Anyway, sorry, go
ahead. No, it's great, and people should read that.
Yeah,
the book is kind of like considered a trash classic, but it's a classic. It's fun to read.
Definitely.
And it expands on the movie in a big way. But so what we could trace then, or we could at least identify as a shift from, let's say, 60s, 70s anti-authoritarianism to 80s, 90s, 2000s, and after pro-authoritarianism. So I think this would actually bring us back to the Chomsky conversation when he was talking about like what is unique about Trump, blah blah blah. I think it ultimately has to do with the rise to power and authority of the baby boom generation and the transformation of that generation's politics over time. And I just mean that in a pure, not generational warfare sense, but in a pure material sense. The baby boomers were such an enormous generation that they literally took over massive cultural industries in the 60s and the 70s, and basically remained dominant in those industries from back then until today. So I would say my inclination would be to examine that shift over time. And I would say two things. One, the collapse of any totalitarian challenger made Americans less reticent about state power, because a crucial aspect of Cold War era propaganda and anti-Nazi propaganda, of course, was that they had groups like the Gestapo or the KGB and the Stasi in East Germany. And so I think that sort of getting rid of that threat also inspired more authoritarian politics here. And then also, I think a general valorization of violence and a belief that the United States could control destiny, could control history, which was expressed internationally with sort of the post-war nation-building projects, and was reflected domestically with things like welfare reform and prison reform and things like that, which were essentially social scientific interventions into the the world. And so I think there's a lot to link these things, and we'd have to locate the change at the level of sort of the actors themselves.
Yeah. Last week on the Majority Report, I interviewed Alexandria Neeson, who has a good piece of Columbia Journalism Review where she talks about just the relationship between, police and the press, and how, and also obviously how that's, racialized, and the authority dynamics, and how, as an example, like when Laquan McDonald was murdered in Chicago in 2015, that basically, the police put out just a completely false narrative that he was attacking, that he had he was doing no such thing. He was actually retreating when that officer, whose name I'm forgetting, who thankfully, it was actually in that case, my God, actually charged, but of course only charged after a lawyer basically unsealed the videotape, and the city, which had been covering up this murder, was forced to reveal the truth. And, she connected it to this very potent history of the relationship between the press and uncritically accepting police narratives. And so, obviously there's many directions to take this, and I think it's another conversation for us would be interesting parallels between, you know, cut the Pentagon, cut the police, you know, the parallels there. Bernie Sanders has actually put forward a great piece of legislation of just a 10% Pentagon cut that would immediately get redirected. You know, another great example of just very solid, real reform, you know, not the end goal, but also something that, you know, no one else is really going to put on the table. But specifically in the context of this conversation, what would you say, even just like legislatively, or I don't know, in terms of exposing for the, like, in the broader public conversation, like what can be done about these relationships between policing, the Pentagon, and culture industries?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it could actually come. The problem is it would have to be mostly through executive action, given the president's unique role as commander-in-chief of the military. If a sympathetic president, an anti-militarist president was elected, that person would be able to do things like direct the military not to consult with various movie companies or video game companies. Congress could theoretically do things like make it illegal for someone who worked in the Pentagon or worked in some defense-related industry or security-related industry to consult for a number of years after they were left their jobs, or even to make it totally legal. That's possible. I don't think it would happen. And so basically, I do think it would have to be executive action, and it would have to be essentially the executive directing the military what to do as commander-in-chief. And I think that would probably be a good thing. I think a major issue would be the fact that the rise of the mercenary industry complicates everything, because nominally private contractors could essentially do what they want. Right. And if I had to guess, it's probably mostly at this point people who are private contractors / consultants doing a lot of that consulting. So you'd have to really consider how to classify private contractors and other groups like that who kind of stand in a gray zone of law, and, you know, purposefully for capitalist interests, essentially.
You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.